Now, I'm very excited to introduce you to our speaker today. So Elle Rose is a writer, creator, and advocate. Now, she's also known as Secret Lady Spider, and is an agender, demisexual, and gray sexual writer, educator, and advocate. Now, Elle wrote a tweet about SpongeBob's asexuality in 2020, and it went viral. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but I certainly did. Realizing that there was a lot of misinformation about the asexual spectrum and being demisexual herself, Elle started writing a blog about demisexuality. Since then, she has become something of a leader in the online sexual community, particularly concerning demisexuality and gray sexuality. Now, Elle has been interviewed about demisexuality by the BBC, Cosmo, Healthline, the Sydney Morning Herald, Les Flix, and the Poema podcast. She has also been a panelist for India Aces and AVEN. In 2023, she is publishing a book about demisexuality with Jessica Kingsley Publishers. So welcome, Elle. I'm so happy to get to meet you and speak with you today. Is there anything else that you think our audience should know about you before we dive in?
I have ADHD, there's that, and I am a disabled asexual advocate as well as being an advocate for demisexuality. So yeah, that's the other things I would say.
Yeah, as a fellow ADHD sufferer, I'm right there with you. So thank you for sharing that with us. Now, I'm really excited to learning a little bit more about asexuality with you. So let's kind of start with the basics here. How would you define asexuality, and what would you describe as that asexuality spectrum?
Yeah, so asexuality is the experience of having little to no sexual attraction to anyone of any gender. This doesn't necessarily mean someone is celibate or abstinent. Celibacy and abstinence, those are choices, though many aces are both celibate and abstinent. Not experiencing sexual attraction doesn't necessarily mean someone doesn't have sex. Attraction doesn't necessarily equate with action. I know that can be confusing, but that's like a whole topic unto itself. Aces may or may not be aromantic also, so that's experiencing little to no romantic attraction and may have different experiences with romantic orientation, gender. The asexuality spectrum refers to a spectrum of kind of like a gray area between allosexuality and asexuality, where someone may experience rare sexual attraction or only during a certain circumstance. For example, as you said earlier, I am demisexual. That means that I only experience sexual attraction under a specific circumstance of a close bond. And this is different from abstaining from sex until a relationship's serious. Instead, it entails no sexual attraction towards anyone of any gender until that circumstance is met, and maybe not even then. And demisexuality is just one of many micro-labels housed under the asexual umbrella. Each micro-label under the asexuality umbrella or spectrum describes a different experience of rare or conditional sexual attraction, or may describe a certain experience of engaging with sexuality under asexuality. This can also be housed under what's called gray sexuality, which again is kind of it's both an orientation unto itself and also kind of that spectrum between like asexuality and being allosexual or not ace.
I'm loving this, and I am right there with you. I just want to say for everybody who's listening, if maybe you don't have a lot of familiarity with these terms or topics, that is totally fine. Please feel free to keep asking questions if you've got them in the chat thread. I want to make sure that we don't spend a ton of time level setting if that's not what y'all need. But please let us know if you want to dive in deeper on any of the terms or some of the ideas that Elle is talking about. And I love how you kind of break down and do that differentiation between having sexual impulses versus not having them, and how that conflicts with something like being celibate. Because you're right, they don't have to be interrelated at all. I think people do kind of confuse celibacy because it's sometimes for some people it is not a choice. It's something that maybe circumstances are happening and so you are celibate. But you're right, it is absolutely completely separate from whether or not you are feeling those urges at all ever in your life, or like you said, only in certain circumstances. Let's talk about that viral SpongeBob tweet in 2020. I remembered this. I talked to a couple of friends, only one of whom needed prompting of hey, do you remember this? And apart from me just saying, do you remember that SpongeBob tweet about a while back? Do you remember that? So this absolutely had very far-reaching reaching implications there. Can you tell us like kind of what prompted it?
Yeah, it wasn't really anything big. Nickelodeon tweeted out some characters who, like with rainbows for Pride Month, they had Korra from Legend of Korra, Schwoz, I think I'm saying that right. I've never seen Henry Danger, but from Henry Danger, and SpongeBob from SpongeBob SquarePants. And a lot of people were in the comments saying, like, they were like, well, the creative show said he's asexual, so he can't be, and like asexuality can refer both to an organism like a sea sponge reproducing asexually or like an amoeba, or as a sexual orientation, which I think a lot of people get hung up on as well. There's a really old blog called Haven for the Human Amoeba that like started a lot of this online, but that's like a whole ace history lesson, but you should look it up if you're interested. But I quote tweeted it and I put it out there. I was like, SpongeBob could be gay and asexual. Like, that is to say he could be homoromantic and asexual. And I left Twitter for a few hours and I came back and it was like on the top of the trending page. And it was very surreal. I was just like, what is going on? And I got a lot of support. I got a lot of hateful messages too, which were very confusing because people were like, why are you hiding in the comments? And I was like, what are you talking about? And I got a lot of support also though. But after seeing support from other aces, like I started talking more about demisexuality, kind of snowballed. And that's kind of why I say I accidentally became an asexuality advocate. So I'm like, not that I mind talking about this, but the way I became known for it was completely by accident. So, I mean, it worked out, but yeah, that's kind of the long and short of it. I saw that being quoted by a bunch of articles too, and I still see that sometimes. Oh yeah, that's right.
Oh yeah, that was the thing I did.
Yeah.
I love kind of learning a little bit more about the backstory there because you're right. It can be very, I'm not on Twitter, but I am, on other forms, other platforms for social media. And it can be really weird to try to kind of see like what really resonates with people and what doesn't. Because I don't know about you, but for me, it feels roughly the same, right? I'm putting a little bit of thought into things. I'm creating them. I want to share them with the world. But it's got to be kind of a bit bizarre to be used to doing that and not have this kind of reaction. And then to suddenly be like, well, I tweeted out this thing. And then all this thing happened. So that is just bonkers. I love that. We do have a really great question coming in the chat thread here. Alyssa had asked, could you speak a little bit about why a person's sexuality is relevant or important in the workplace? And I think this is a very good question because there's a lot of people that might not really see and make the connection. So what would you say to this person?
That is definitely a multifaceted question. I don't think it just applies to asexuals for sure. I think that applies to everybody. But no matter where you're working or what you're doing, inclusion of queer people, especially in a time where there are people violently pushing back with anti-trans legislation, anti-LGBT legislation, things like that, being at a workplace where that can be affirming, where you can be safely out there is huge. I have worked in places where they said you could be out and like they were also like really not supportive of it. And I have my current workplace. I am looking for a different job, but that's neither here nor there. But I will say one thing I will miss about it and that I'm looking for in other workplaces is that there is a queer friendly space. It makes working there feel a lot safer. And that's essential no matter who you are, like no matter your gender or sexuality, whether you're like not queer at all or, not just cis, straight, not queer people deserve to feel safe at work. Queer people deserve to feel safe at work also. And I think that's really like, I don't necessarily think it pertains to every conversation in the workplace, but it also shouldn't be the situation where people are like afraid to talk about it. That happens so often with places that say they are, but they don't actually offer any like support for people who are queer in their workplace, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And I think I really, thank you to Alyssa for asking this question, but also thank you, Elle, for your explanation, because I feel like it depends. Obviously, there's a broad generalization, but in my lived experience, it's usually a bunch of cisgender, heterosexual white men that have these kinds of questions. And that's okay. That's fine. Asking questions is great. But I think it does lead into, a lot of people see things like this, us wanting to discuss these topics, and they think, well, because their sexuality or their their gender presentation or whatever has never been an issue for them or never been something that they had to put any real thought into, that people maybe necessarily don't understand how many facets of your life this actually impacts. We're not talking about wanting to be able to discuss your sex life in the office. We're talking about what your lived experience is like. And so I do think, I think the title of today's session about asexuality kind of being the overlooked letter in the acronym is very important, because you're right. You are talking about, kind of the alphabet mafia tent. And within that, there are going to be people that have all kinds of different, different presentations, different orientations, all kinds of things. So I do think that is important. What do you say to people that just think that this is about talking about your sex life in the office?
Oh, my first reaction is kind of to laugh sarcastically, because I'm like, I'm not sure where you got that idea. I have had way more conversations with, well, actually, to be honest, cis, straight, white men about their sex lives than I have ever had about my own. And I'm not really interested in sharing that. And it's not been like across the board. It's not been in every workplace. But when it has happened, there's no pushback. There's no, there's no like room to say, hey, I'm uncomfortable with that topic. Like there's no, it's just awkward. My very first job ever, I was like a 17-year-old working at a Taco Bell. My manager was 26, and he propositioned me for a threesome. And I was like, I talked to the manager, and she was like, oh, he does that to everybody. And that was normal. And that shouldn't be normal. So it's not about, and that's neither here nor there towards queerness. I know that may be a little bit of a side tangent, but I do think the oversexualization of queerness and automatically assuming that it's about sexuality is both misleading and also paves the way for things like people talking about their sex lives and other people not really being able to refute that, or people not being able to safely say, hey, I was sexually harassed. Like, I think that is a huge part of it, is like, we either need to make everybody feel included, or we create the environment we have now, which historically has not been working for us. And also, like, people also will be like, oh, like, I don't need to know what you do in the bedroom. You don't know what I do in the bedroom or don't do in the bedroom by me telling you my sexuality. Just like I don't know what you do in the bedroom. If you say, hey, I'm not queer, I don't need to know what you do, I don't know what you do either. You are automatically tying the over-sexualization of queerness to my coming out. That is, in a way, it's a me problem because I'm choosing to try to educate people, but more broadly, it is a them problem. And that's like a whole cultural thing about queerness. I'm sorry, I feel like I could write a whole thing about all these questions.
Well, these are very important topics to talk about, because like you said, that over sexualization of the queer experience or of the gay experience it's incredibly pervasive, right? It's very pervasive within at least American culture. And so it does, it is something that I see this more from outside the tent than inside, that like people are very quick to say like, all right, well, if this is what we're talking about, we must be talking about sex. And it's like, no, it is, the impact of the impact of this orientation on the rest of your life can be very, it can be very, very impactful, very powerful. And for some people, it's just not. It's a facet and it's there, but it's not something that really, is something that they want to make sure people are clear on. And so it really does depend, from person to person, what people want to discuss when it comes to this. You brought up an interesting idea here when it comes to kind of the misunderstanding that might come from within that group. So can you tell us why you think that asexuality is sometimes overlooked and misunderstood during Pride, as well as within queer spaces more broadly?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of contributing factors, and I don't even think I could actually get into all of them. But for starters, we live in a world that proudly declares everyone has sexual attraction. There's a very strong expectation of that, to the point where like conversion therapy and like medicalization of asexuality is still a pretty big issue. There's something called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is basically medicalizing having low libido, which aces can have high or low libido. Or there's also like just ways that are supposed to medically fix it. And there's also this expectation that everyone has romantic attraction, and being ace doesn't necessarily mean that someone is aromantic. People get those confused a lot. There is overlap in communities and overlap in like these experiences. And learning about asexuality is a lot to learn. There's a whole spectrum of experiences and terms that kind of require a deep dive to really understand. Many people don't know how or where to access that information. Asexuality is also seen as new when it really isn't. And it's also not new to the queer spaces. Like there's a lot of history between, particularly between the bi community and the ace community, like bis kind of taking aces into their fold, which I think is really neat. And there's also like, people are like, oh, it's just the internet. No, people are talking about it more because they have community access thanks to the internet. Like it's not necessarily, it's not a bad thing. Additionally, within queer spaces, I think there's pushback, not just because of the lack of knowledge of and exposure, also because queer sexualities are, again, over-sexualized and looked at as perverse. So there's a lot of, we don't care what you do in the bedroom, don't shove us in our faces, queerness, like being sexualized, to the point where like if a lesbian couple shares like a peck, then it's considered really inappropriate for children. But, you know, if a straight couple gets it on, then it's not always considered inappropriate. I definitely saw some sex scenes as a kid that I was like, and it was just brushed off, you know, because those were not queer sex scenes. Then when someone says, I'm not sexually attracted to anyone, you not only have a lifelong message like towards other queer people that everyone has sexual attraction, but also that you have to fight for the right to experience sex if you'd like to with the same gender or genders that you're sexually attracted to. And asexuality kind of feels like a contradiction within that. Then on top of that, there's also like, it seems like there are contradictions within asexuality that aren't contradictions, such as aces who masturbate or aces who have and enjoy sex, for example. On top of that, there's also this idea that cisgender women, or for that matter, anyone assigned female at birth, and doesn't necessarily desire sexual pleasure in the first place, which is a very heterosexist idea, which also couples up with those who are cisgender male or assigned male at birth, maybe, you know, trans non-binary, whole umbrella there, are always seeking it. So again, there's heterosexual, or like there's the heterosexism there as well. Beyond that, many people are over-sexualized or desexualized on the basis of race, which leads to a variety of differing ace experiences that further challenge what are perceived as norms in much of Western culture. A lot of learning about the nuances and complexities surrounding asexuality. That means unlearning your expectations for sexual behavior, gender, presentation, and also includes unlearning the idea that all queerness is inherently sexual, which requires, I think, for a lot of queer people, unpacking a lot of trauma. And this doesn't necessarily just apply to the ace community. You also can see it in like bi couples who like appear straight, or bisexual cisgender women who are married to not queer men. And there's also like this, oh, you can't be queer if. There's like a lot of overlap between people who don't accept those experiences, like that look queer enough to them, and those who don't want to learn about asexuality. It's definitely a very complicated topic. But yeah, I could go on, but I think I've done enough.
No, I mean, I think that that's a really good dive, and you're right. It does there. It's kind of it's not surprising, but it is disappointing how many times we do kind of come back to that same thing of like visible diversity, visible, you know, do you look like you should be in that group? Do you know, is this something that people can like spot off the bat? And I feel like we address this not only in terms of, you know, people within the LGBTQIA plus community, but we have this kind of challenge when it comes to, you know, the staffing efforts that we do. You know, diversity is not skin deep. It is not just, do you look different than the people sitting around you in your office? You know, there very much are levels and nuances and multi-dimensional facets to what goes into that experience and what makes somebody a part of a specific community.
Yeah, it can be partially what you look like, for sure, but there's also like I mean, especially when you get into like race and sexuality, and there's like, especially within asexuality, and I would not be the person to ask about that because I'm white, obviously, but there are many aces of color, particularly Black aces, who have talked about the experience of being over-sexualized and then coming out as ace, and that being seen as like, oh, therefore I can't have access to you, and being seen as like wrong. But then there's also
alienating or something.
yeah, and then there's also like the question of presentation as non-binary or trans people. Like I know I present very femme, but it's like costuming to me. And so you have perceptions versus reality, which is interesting because a lot of the queer community is like, oh, we want to dismantle these perceptions, and then not all of them actually take the time or energy to do that, like outside of maybe a little bit of themselves. So it's not just aces, but it's like a whole broad thing, I think, that a lot of us are dealing with right now.
Yeah. Okay. We had a question from the chat here. Gray had said, do you feel like you've received more pushback from the queer community about your identity rather than cis het folks? Like how their interactions, their reactions, or the ensuing discussions compare? Gray says, I feel like I've received more hurtful reactions from fellow queer folks that aren't aro or ace than I have with straight people. Has this been your experience?
Yeah, well, first, I'm sorry that happened to you, Gray. That sucks. But yeah, that's actually been my experience too. A lot of my like friends who are not queer are generally like, I don't know what that means, but good on you. And then a lot of queer spaces, like I get people will track me down on other social medias and be like, I wanted to block you on all these things. And I'm like, well, then why did you come over here? Because I said something about asexuality. I get, I do get support, and I also get a lot of other queer people who do a lot of pushback, which is mostly, in my experience so far, mostly been online. When I went to my first Pride recently, which yay, and it was awesome. And there were tons of ace flags there. Nobody cared that I was wearing a demisexual flag as a cape. Like nobody said, "Oh, you don't belong here." Nobody. I didn't have to defend that. And generally in real life spaces, like, which is not to say that the internet is not real life, but I guess physical spaces. I don't know how we're defining that nowadays. There's been less pushback with other queer people. But when I get on the internet, which is where I do most of my writing and everything like that, there's major pushback. And I'm not sure why that is. And I've found that most people have described a similar experience as well, like who have
Yeah.
gone to Pride and things like that.
Makes sense. All right, we only have 5 minutes left. I want to make sure we still touch on a couple topics we haven't touched on yet. This has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours. All right, let's talk about some of the social and professional implications of asexuality. What can employers do to be sensitive to these things?
Well, socially, there's definitely pushback. It's often seen as something that needs to be fixed or repaired. Often, when ACEs come out to friends, family, or even coworkers, it's seen as coming out as being a survivor of sexual violence or trauma, whether or not that's like something somebody's been subjected to. People of any sexuality can unfortunately undergo that experience. There's also the infantilization, sorry, of asexuality, and sex is kind of seen as something that this shows that you're mature. And those who use the term virgin as an insult, really it's just a neutral word that means if you've had sex or not. I think the best things employers can do, and this wouldn't just apply to ACEs, but consciously include asexuals in queer affirming spaces if you're going to have them, which you should have them. And also believe employees when they come out as asexual, respect their contributions to discussions about the inclusion of asexuality in the workplace. And of course, again, that goes beyond asexuality, but if you're talking specifically about us, I think you should reach out, ask if there are ACEs who are available to help with resources when you're putting them together, create welcoming environments. And if you're going to say, hey, this is our LGBT space, please include like the QIA. I don't feel like that's asking too much.
Yes, of course. All right, so we did get a question from Brigitte wanting to know what resources or books would you recommend on asexuality or demisexuality? So if people are interested in learning more about this, where would you direct them?
Yeah, so a big one again is AVEN, or the Asexuality and Visibility Education Network. There is the Demisexuality Resource Center, which is also demisexuality.org, I want to say. There's the Ace and Arrow Advocacy Project, which I am also a part of. There's A's Journal, International Asexuality Day. Books in particular, I would say The Invisible Orientation by Julie Sandra Decker. Ace by Angela Chen has been really good. Most of the books by Alice Osman, those are fictional rather than nonfiction, but she has a lot of asexual and also there's some demisexual representation in her work as well. Gosh, there are a lot of activists who talk about asexuality. Let's say David J. Bradley, Sarah Cosgrove, Dr. Claudia Antolini, Marshall Blunt, also Gentle Giant Ace, Tyre Songbird, Ace Dad, the Ace Couple podcast, Sounds Fake But Okay podcast. There are a whole lot of others. Obviously, I also write about it too. You can learn about it also. I speak more about demisexuality specifically on my blog, which would be medium.com/secretladyspider, and also my Twitter and Instagram, which are both Secret Lady Spider. So there's that too.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those resources. And if y'all have questions or you're trying to look up those resources, obviously we went pretty fast, but the recording will be available of this chat in the coming weeks. So make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel so you don't miss when that goes live, but we will try and link as many of those resources mentioned as we can. All right, in our last 2 minutes, tell us about our upcoming book and where people can connect with you, can follow what you're doing. Tell us all about this.
Yeah, so the book is set to be published in 2023. The exact date and title is yet to be determined. It's meant to be about a demisexuality, mixture of memoir and education, similar in the vein to, Kelsey Osgood's How to Disappear Completely, but that book is about an eating disorder, so this book will not be. As far as following me, I'm Secret Lady Spider with the first E removed on most platforms. You can directly support my work on Patreon, which would be patreon.com/secretladyspider, or you can email me, secretladyspider@gmail.com. And again, Twitter and Instagram. And on the email, the E is there. Just Twitter didn't let me have all 15 characters. So Twitter is the main place I hang out, but, and I also have a link tree, which you can also find on my Twitter. So if you want to find where everything is, all the interviews I've done, this will be on here as soon as like the video is live and everything. You can also go there too. And that will just list everything. It should be a lot faster.
Excellent. Yes, I love this. Elle, thank you so much for joining us today. This time has gone really, really fast. I cannot wait to, hopefully get to reconnect with you in the future and do another one of these. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was really wonderful to learn from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.